Ukraine launched a weapon that is unstoppable, unblockable, and costs almost nothing. And this weapon, in a single operation, swept away Russian brigades repeatedly, trapped thousands of soldiers between floodwaters and enemy fire, and severed Russia's entire northern supply line. Putin's entire 2026 summer offensive collapsed in a single move. And when you trace everything currently happening on the front lines, the collapse of Russia's 2026 spring offensive, with approximately 150,000 casualties, the first net territorial loss since August 2024, the liberation of villages in Kharkiv pushing the Russians back to the border, the collapse of the unbreakable defense lines in the south in a single day, you reach the starting point of this domino chain. A single dam operation paralyzed an entire front. And now look at the table. May 2026. The Russian front line is under pressure at every point from north to south and completely unprepared for a counter-offensive from any direction. Because the mechanized forces needed to stop that offensive are stuck in the floodwaters and mud of Belgorod. Zelensky announced on May 22nd, 590 square kilometers of territory has been recaptured since the start of the year.
Від початку року 590 кілометрів нашої території звільнено.
Look at where these 590 square kilometers were recaptured. A map of the Belgorod domino chain emerges. As of May 2026, Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv are pushing the Russians toward the Belgorod border by liberating villages, a border that is already collapsed, stripped of air defense, and declared a frontline zone by its governor. Kupiansk, the railway hub Russia has been trying to besiege since November 2025, has fully come under Ukrainian control. The situation in the south is even bleaker. In March to April 2026, the so-called unbreakable defenses crumbled in a single day following the Alexandrivka counter-offensive. The first mass surrenders were recorded. Rybar, a pro-Russian source, summed it up in a single word: disastrous. As of mid-May, Russian forces on the Zaporizhia axis are pinned down along the Yanchekrak River, with no freedom of movement. Does Russia have the strength to turn this situation around? A significant portion of its mechanized forces is stuck in the mud of Belgorod. The 70,500 contracts signed in the first quarter of 2026 aren't making up for the losses. The army is losing more than it's gaining. An army with depleted tank and armored vehicle stocks and shattered morale is attempting to defend itself simultaneously in Kharkiv, the south, Crimea, and Kursk. But Ukraine has pushed up to the Belgorod border in the north, is cutting off Crimea's supply lines in the south. Defending everywhere means being unable to defend anywhere. The water flowing from the Belgorod Dam did not merely paralyze a single front, it toppled Russia's entire 2026 war plan like dominoes. And now those dominoes are still falling. This doctrine is not Ukraine's invention, it's thousands of years old. But Ukraine redefined it. Russians call it Rasputitsa, the season when roads cease to exist. Every spring and autumn, Ukraine's black clay soil dissolves, fields turn to swamps, roads turn to rivers. And this mud has been the grave of invaders for centuries. General Mud, the nickname for the quagmire, has been more effective than the most expensive weapon systems for centuries. And in 2022, Putin repeated the same mistake on the same soil. When Russian tanks crossed the border in late February, Western analysts had calculated they'll finish before the Rasputitsa begins. But Putin underestimated two things: Ukraine's resistance and Ukraine's terrain. When March arrived, mud season began. Every vehicle that left the asphalt got stuck. Some tanks literally sank into the earth. Vehicles that couldn't move formed convoys stretching kilometers on narrow roads. The famous 64-kilometer convoy from the north got jammed in these conditions and couldn't advance for days. And these convoys became stationary targets for Bayraktar TB2s and Javelins. But Ukraine didn't just wait for the mud, it used it strategically. It destroyed bridges, cut main roads, and forced Russian convoys into narrow corridors and muddy side roads. Armored vehicles unable to move off asphalt were condemned to predictable routes. Mud was a passive ally. Nature was doing its own work. Ukraine was merely optimizing conditions. But the first moment Ukraine turned nature into an active weapon happened elsewhere. The last days of February 2022, Russian Marines had built 3 pontoon bridges across the Irpin River, the last obstacle on the road to Kyiv. Ukrainian units destroyed 2 pontoons but suffered heavy losses and requested withdrawal. The request was denied because retreating meant opening the road to Kyiv. Instead, Ukrainian engineers blew the Kozarovichi Dam. The first attempt failed. The second attempt breached it. Water flowing from the Kyiv reservoir into the Irpin River valley instantly turned the area into a shallow lake. The village of Demidiv was completely submerged, but the village going underwater meant Kyiv's salvation. Russian tanks sank into mud. The staging area prepared for the final assault became a swamp. The 3 pontoon bridges became useless. The river was now too wide and fast to support pontoons. The New York Times described it as the war's most important engineering operation. June 2023. Russia destroyed the Kakhovka Dam. The collapse of the massive structure in southern Ukraine flooded the Dnieper River. 80 billion liters of water were released. Vast agricultural areas went underwater. Tens of thousands were evacuated. The river ecosystem, farmland, drinking water sources were devastated. Even the cooling water for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant was endangered. And Ukraine's southern counteroffensive plans were seriously disrupted, which was exactly what Russia had aimed for. The Dnieper's flooding made planned crossing points for the counterattack impassable. Kakhovka was condemned by the world, but it also taught Ukraine something. The water weapon works in the opposite direction too. If Russia used the Dnieper against Ukraine, Ukraine could use the Siversky Donets against Russia. Kakhovka sparked a war crimes debate, but it also planted the seed for a doctrine's reverse evolution. Russia's weapon would be turned back on Russia. The defensive weapon was about to become an offensive weapon, and this transformation took place in the autumn of 2025 in Belgorod. To understand the Belgorod operation, you first need to understand what Russia was doing that summer, because this operation was not a reaction, it was a trap. The summer of 2025 was extremely hot. The Siversky Donets and Vovcha rivers dried up, water levels hit record lows. Russia saw this as a golden opportunity. It opened crossing routes through dried riverbeds, established new supply lines to Vovchansk, and achieved local advances at the front. Ukraine's 16th Army Corps later made the picture clear in their statement. The enemy tried to fully take advantage of the window of opportunity. After the lack of precipitation and the hellish summer, the dried-up riverbeds simplified their logistics and allowed temporary local advances. On October 26th, Putin was given a report. "We control 70% of Vovchansk." Russia felt strong, and that was precisely the moment the trap was about to close. On the night of Saturday, October 25th, the first strikes came. HIMARS attacks on the Belgorod Reservoir Dam, creating initial structural damage. On Sunday, October 26th, at approximately 3 p.m., the second wave. Commander Robert Magyar Brovdy's Birds 1 unit, the former 14th Regiment of the Unmanned Systems Forces, struck the dam with Dart-type kamikaze drones. The operation's name? Dam, hold on if anything! The water level dropped 100 centimeters. Serious gaps opened in the concrete structure. Uncontrolled water flow reached the Siversky Donets, and then nature took over. The overflowing river first submerged Russian military positions near the village of Grafivka on the Russian side of the border. Trenches, shelters, ammunition depots went underwater. Then it crossed the border into occupied Kharkiv Oblast, hitting villages along the supply routes to Vovchansk. And the most critical consequence, the main supply bridge across the Siversky Donets became unusable. Russia's only reliable route to the Vovchansk front was severed. Ukraine's 16th Army Corps statement summarized the situation. The enemy tried to exploit the drought. Dried riverbeds had simplified logistics, but now the units that managed to cross the Siversky Donets have been effectively cut off from their main forces. We're expecting the POW exchange pool to be replenished. Affected Russian units. The 128th, 116th, 68th, and 136th Motorized Infantry Brigades, plus the 82nd Regiment and 138th Brigade of the 6th Army and 44th Army Corps. According to Ukrainian sources reported by Defense Express, the 1st Battalion of the 82nd Airborne Division was nearly completely wiped out. Only the command staff remained. The unit had to be withdrawn for replenishment. Potentially tens of thousands of soldiers were either physically underwater or had their supply lines cut. What happens to units that cannot be logistically supported? Artillery runs out of ammunition and falls silent. Tanks run out of fuel and become immobile, and an immobile tank is a stationary target. Soldiers without food and water see their morale and physical resistance collapse. Floodwaters and thick mud render existing trenches unusable while armored vehicles get stuck. And if retreat routes are also cut, which they were, troops are literally trapped between Ukrainian forces and rising waters. You can't advance, the enemy is ahead. You can't retreat, there's no bridge, no road, everything is mud. You stay in place, but your position is underwater. This is siege and drowning in the literal sense. Soldiers are forced to fight both enemy fire and nature itself, and you can't raise a white flag against nature. The Belgorod Dam was a tactical success on its own, but its consequences were far greater. This operation was the first link in the domino chain that collapsed Russia's 2026 offensive plan. In October 2025, the Vovchansk front was paralyzed. Entering winter, isolated units couldn't be resupplied. No ammunition, fuel, food, or medical supplies reaching them. Combat capability dropped within weeks. In March to April 2026, Russia launched its spring offensive, but couldn't assemble sufficient force on the Kharkiv front. According to United 24's analysis, January to April 2026 was Russia's worst period since 2023. The spring offensive campaign collapsed with approximately 100,000 casualties. Over the year, Russia managed to gain only 300 square kilometers of territory, a third of which was border area infiltration in Sumy. In April, Russia lost net territory for the first time since August 2024, 46 square miles, twice the size of Manhattan. ISW data shows the trend worsening, 45 more square miles lost in the last 4 weeks. According to Deep State's OSINT data, Russia gained only 300 square kilometers total in 2 months, a third of which was Sumy border infiltrations. The statistics are merciless. Record low advances despite record high casualties. And here Ukraine's dual strike comes into play. Nature cut the logistics. Technology wore down the rest. While the Belgorod flood operations severed supply lines, FPV drone saturation was eroding Russian units at the front. According to United 24, FPV drones are now responsible for over 90% of the Russian army's casualties. Middle strike drones are hitting targets 200 kilometers deep. Nature plus technology equals Ukraine's asymmetric warfare formula. West Point's Modern War Institute compared this strategy to Allied strategic bombing in World War II, striking not the front, but the mechanism feeding the front. But with one difference. The Allies hit factories with thousands of bombers. Ukraine struck a dam with a few drones and achieved the same result: logistical paralysis, through the power of nature. The cost of the dam operation: a few drones and a few HIMARS rockets. The result? The collapse of an entire front, the failure of an offensive plan, and tens of thousands of soldiers taken out of action. This cost-to-effect ratio may be recorded as one of the most striking examples in modern military history. At this point, it's necessary to see the balance and discuss the ethical dimension. Russia still maintains a presence in Vovchansk. It lost offensive capacity, but hasn't fully withdrawn. The flood degraded units, but didn't destroy them. Some were repositioned, some reinforced. And with its population of 145 million, Russia's manpower pool remains massive. But there's a more important issue: civilian cost. The Belgorod Dam was the water source for 420,000 people. More than 10 settlements went underwater. Evacuations began. With winter approaching, energy infrastructure had also been struck. People faced flood and cold simultaneously. These people are civilians. They didn't start the war. And the Kakhovka symmetry is unavoidable. Russia destroyed the Kakhovka Dam in June 2023. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians were evacuated. Ecological disaster ensued. Ukraine's counteroffensive was disrupted. The world condemned Russia. Now Ukraine struck the Belgorod Dam. The scale is different, the method is different, but the principle of using water as a weapon is the same. Both sides turn nature into a weapon, and on both sides, civilians were harmed. From a legal perspective of war, there is an important distinction. According to the analysis in Fortune, Ukraine's Irpin operation